This week we will be looking at defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms and anxiety. In order to deal with this anxiety, people use defense mechanisms to help them cope. Although we are sometimes aware that we use them, in many cases these defenses occur unconsciously and work to distort our reality. While all defense mechanisms can be unhealthy, they can also be adaptive and allow us to function normally. The greatest problems arise when defense mechanisms are overused in order to avoid dealing with problems. Denial is the first defense mechanism we will look at. It is probably one of the best known defense mechanisms. It's used often to describe those who seem unable to deal with reality or admit an obvious truth. Example, he's in denial. Denial is an outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is currently occurring. A good example of denial would be someone who is abusing drugs or alcohol, and family members, co-workers, friends could be confronting this person about their abuse, and they want to just say that everything's fine and that they're not having a problem. That would be huge denial. Again, drug addicts or alcoholics often deny that they have a problem, while victims of traumatic events may deny that the event ever occurred. Denials function to protect the mind from things that the individual cannot cope with. While this may save us from anxiety or pain, denial also requires a substantial investment of energy. The second defense mechanism we will study is repression. Repression acts to keep information out of conscious awareness. However, these memories don't just disappear, they continue to influence our behavior. For example, a person has repressed memories of abuse suffered as a child may later have difficulty forming relationships. Sometimes we do this consciously by forcing the unwanted information out of our awareness, which is known as suppression. The third defense mechanism we will look at is displacement. If you ever have had a bad day at work, then have gone home and taken out your frustration on your family and friends, you have experienced displacement. Displacement involves taking out our frustrations, feelings, and impulses on people or objects that are less threatening. Displaced aggression is a common example. Rather than express our anger in ways that could lead to negative consequences, like arguing with our boss, we instead express our anger towards a person or object that poses no threat, such as our spouse, children, or pets. Next, we will look at sublimation. Sublimation is a defense mechanism that allows us to act out unacceptable impulses by converting these behaviors into a more acceptable form. For example, a person experiencing extreme anger might take up kickboxing as a means of venting frustration. Psychologists believe that sublimation was a sign of maturity that allows people to function normally in socially acceptable ways. Projection is a defense mechanism that involves taking our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and ascribing them to other people. For example, if you have a strong dislike for someone, you might instead believe that he or she does not like you. Projection functions to allow the expression of the desire or the impulse, but in a way that the mind cannot recognize, therefore reducing anxiety. Intellectualization. This works to reduce anxiety by thinking about events in a cold, clinical way. This defense mechanism allows us to avoid thinking about the stressful, emotional aspect of the situation and focus only on the intellectual component. For example, a person who has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness might focus on learning everything about the disease in order to avoid distress and remain distant from the reality of the situation. Another defense mechanism is rationalization. This is a defense mechanism that involves explaining an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner, avoiding the true explanation for the behavior. For example, a person who is turned down for a date might rationalize the situation by saying they weren't attracted to the other person anyway. Or a student who blames a poor exam score on the instructor rather than his or her lack of preparation. Regression. When confronted by stressful events, people sometimes abandon coping skills and revert to patterns of behavior used earlier in development. For example, an individual fixated at an earlier developmental age might cry or sulk upon hearing unpleasant news. The regression defense mechanism is often paralleled to Freud's developmental stages. Behaviors associated with a regression can vary greatly depending upon which stage the person is fixated at. An individual fixated at the oral stage might begin eating or smoking excessively, or might become verbally aggressive. A fixation at the anal stage might result in excessive tidiness or messiness. Acting out. The individual copes with stress by engaging in actions rather than reflecting upon internal feelings. Another defense mechanism is avoidance. This is refusing to deal with or encounter unpleasant objects or situations. Compensation is overachieving in one area to compensate for failures in another. And humor, pointing out that the funny or ironic aspects of a situation. The last defense mechanism we will take a look at is passive aggression. It is a combination of negative attitude and inactivity, often characterized by learned helplessness. A careless attitude about deadlines or being on time. People also feel like they are the innocent victim of someone else's unfair treatment. They invent ways to create conflict with those closest to them because ultimately they fear intimacy. Passive-aggressive people also refuse to take responsibility for their own actions and, worse yet, want others punished. There can be a number of causes behind the development of passive-aggressive traits in individuals. The most probable is growing up in a family or social atmosphere where not much importance is given to an individual's needs and wants, where expressing personal desires is not accepted and is taken as a selfish and self-centered nature.